In this video, we'll be talking about economic theories, what economic theories are, how they work, and what their different components are. As usual, if you find these videos useful, please don't forget to like and subscribe and share the videos with classmates and friends. And if you have suggestions for further videos, further topics that you'd like me to cover, just leave a comment down below and I will try to get to as many of them as I can. All right, so let's start by giving a sort of, as we did in the case of scarcity, a kind of informal definition of what a theory is. So now, when I say theory, I'm talking about a theory in the context of science, specifically social science, and even more specifically, economics. So a theory is really just an explanatory model of the world. Okay? It's an explanatory model of the world. So every word in this sentence is important. So first of all, let's start with this one here. Let's start with explanatory. Okay? A theory is meant to explain something. So you might observe, for example, that, I don't know, housing in all major cities on Earth right now are pretty expensive. That's something that you could just observe. You know, you go out, you look for an apartment to rent or a house to buy, you find that things are pretty expensive. Well, what explains that? An economic theory might come in and say, well, this is actually how these high prices can be explained. Okay, so they try to explain things in the real world. Now, theories are models, okay? They are not just an exact replica of the real world. That would be completely useless. Okay, the real world is right before our eyes. If we could simply look at the real world or the data of the real world and just understand it right away, we wouldn't need theories. Okay, theories model the real world. They make some simplifying assumptions. They get rid of some noise. Okay, and they say, here are the main things you have to consider to be able to understand whatever the theory is meant to explain. Okay, so those are two very important parts. So that's what a theory is. Now, a theory makes use of several components, and we'll write these down. I'll just give brief explanations for each one. So, theories involve variables, right? So variables are well-defined items that can take on various specific values. Okay? So what makes something a variable is that it's a quantity, okay, that is very well defined, such as a price or such as a price or a quantity, something like that. But it can take on multiple values. In other words, it's not fixed. It's not like I say like, okay, the price is $5. You see, that wouldn't be a variable. That would be a constant, right? A variable would be something like P. And within the theory, P can be equal to 5, P can be equal to 3, P can be equal to 0.11238, etc., right? P can take on multiple variables, therefore multiple values rather, therefore P is a variable. Okay, next, theories always make use of assumptions. Okay, now an assumption is simply a statement about the world that has not been proven. It has simply been assumed. It has been taken to be true for the sake of the theory. Let me give you a very, very specific example of this to see what I mean. We'll see in later videos that all else being equal, usually when the price of a good increases, people tend to buy less of that good. Now, in some theories, that might be something that the theory proves or explains or demonstrates, but in other cases, it'll just be assumed. Okay, so if you read an economics textbook, specifically more advanced economics textbooks, you'll see things like, okay, well, assume that blah, blah, blah. Okay, in our example, we might say, assume that the law of demand holds. In other words, that when the price of something goes up, demand for that thing tends to go down and vice versa. Assume that the law of demand holds. What the economist is doing there, okay, is simply saying, in this theory, we don't want to prove that this is true. We don't want to demonstrate that it's true. We don't want to argue that it's true. We just want to assume that it's true and see what logically follows from that, okay? So assumptions are just statements of fact that are not proven / demonstrated, but simply taken to be true. Okay? And finally, a theory makes use of or makes predictions. Now, I don't think I need to define predictions exactly. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. But the whole point of a theory is to, well, I mean, we already said that it's to explain, but more than that, it's to make predictions. It's to say, okay, if this theory is true, then we should see blah, blah, blah in the real world. Then, of course, you can go out into the real world, see if that's actually the case, and if it is the case, that's evidence that the theory might be onto something, okay? If it's not the case, then it's back to the drawing board. We have to come up with a new theory, or we have to alter the theory, or whatever. Okay, so these are the main sort of components of a theory, okay? And they all fit together in a sort of very specific way, okay? Now let's see let's see how that works. So we're going to draw a sort of flowchart here of the interaction between theory and empirical observation. Empirical observation simply means going out into the real world and actually seeing what's out there. Okay, so a typical theory will start with definitions and assumptions. Okay, so by that we just mean that the economist, all scientists really, but over here we'll talk about economists. What economists do is they say, okay, let's define our terms. Okay, so price is this, quantity is that. The economic agents in question are X, Y, or Z, whatever. Those are the definitions, and these are the assumptions. Let's assume that agents are rational. Let's assume that firms are trying to maximize their profits. Let's assume whatever, okay? They'll make all these assumptions. That'll be like defining the theory, okay? And then, of course, things will follow from those assumptions, okay? So the next step after the definitions and assumptions will be a series of logical deductions. Okay, when you make assumptions and when you define things a certain way, you will be able to infer certain things about the world based on those assumptions. Okay, if I assume that the consumer is rational, it follows from that the consumer cannot prefer A to B, B to C, but C to A. I mean, if I prefer A to B and I prefer B to C, it doesn't really make sense to say that I prefer C to A if I'm rational. Okay, so that would be an example of a logical deduction. And then, of course, from these logical deductions, predictions can be made. Oops. All right, so to go back to an earlier example, well, I mean, if I assume, okay, that, well, yeah, maybe that's not a great example. Let me think here. Okay, well, let's actually just take the example that I just used. You have a rational consumer who, if he prefers A to B and B to C, then he must prefer A to C. Well, if you go out into the real world and you do a survey of consumers and you find that this is actually not true, well, that's actually a problem for the theory, right? So that logical deduction will therefore make a prediction. The prediction says that if consumers are indeed rational, then this is what their preferences will be like. Okay, so of course, to get to that point, you have to go out into the world and you have to make empirical observations, right? You have to go out into the world and you have to say, okay, do these predictions actually work? Like, is this true? Now, if it is, okay, then you're good. The theory has passed a certain kind of test, and you've just found some evidence in favor of your theory. Okay, so the next step here is, after the empirical observations are made, conclusions are drawn. Okay, so either the theory provides a better explanation of the facts than alternative theories, or it doesn't. Okay? And if it doesn't, it'll be because it's in contradiction or in conflict with evidence. Okay, so let's take that path first. Let's say that we go out into the world, we test the predictions that logically follow from our assumptions, and for whatever reason, it doesn't work. Okay? The theory is in conflict with evidence. Well, then you kind of have two options. You can modify the theory, right? In light of the new knowledge, right? And then you get basically all the way back to square one. Okay, you modify the theory, and once you do that, you go back to defining things and assuming things, making logical deductions, making the predictions, testing it, drawing a conclusion, whatever. The circle kind of restarts. Or you simply discard theory. Okay, this is sometimes an unfortunate possibility for the proponents of the theory. If the theory is just really not working and there's just no way to modify it to make it better, you just discard it. Okay? Now, if, however, the theory is not in contradiction to the evidence, if it works, well, the theory has passed the test. That's good. Does that prove that the theory is true? No, it doesn't prove it, but it's evidence in favor of the theory. Okay? The theory should be subjected to constant scrutiny, even if it passed the test, but for the purposes of this diagram, the theory has passed the test, and the economist could go home satisfied with herself because she's come up with a theory that now has evidence in its favor. All right, so before we move on to the next topic, I just want to add a quick note to this video about causation and correlation. All right, now Very often, an economist will be interested in establishing causal relationships between two things. The economist will want to prove that prices going up causes consumers to actually consume less of that thing, right? But this is actually not as simple as it looks at first, okay? And we can't really go into details. In fact, you don't need the details for an intro level course, but there are very sort of advanced statistical methods that are used to prove causation, right? But that's not really the point of this video. The point of this section of the video is to simply flag that there is a difference between causation. One thing actually causes something else to happen versus simple correlation, okay? So what is correlation? Well, let's take a graph, okay? And let's have sleep in terms of hours on this axis, okay? And let's have coffee consumption in terms of liters on this axis. And let's say we go out into the world, we take a survey of a representative sample of people, and we find that in general, people who sleep less drink more coffee, and people who sleep more drink less coffee. So we might have a graph that looks something like this. These are all data points, right? And there's this definite downward trend, right? These are all, each of these dots represents a different person in the survey, okay? So what this graph is telling us that as the number of hours of sleep decreases, coffee drinking tends to increase, right? So over here, this is what's called a negative correlation. Sleep and coffee consumption are negatively correlated because as the amount of sleep increases, the amount of coffee decreases and vice versa. It's a negative correlation. Now, does this prove, okay, that lack of sleep causes increased coffee consumption? Well, the answer is no. You can't assume that just because we've established correlation, we can also establish causation. Well, why might that be? Well, what if it's the other way around? What if the reason people are sleeping less, okay, these people here, is because they drink more coffee? What if it's actually the coffee consumption that's causing them to sleep less? What if there's some third variable that's causing both less sleep and more coffee, right? Like, I don't know, being a new parent, all right? Being a new parent causes you to sleep less, and because you're awake more, you just happen to drink more coffee, all right? So it has nothing to, it's not that sleep is causing coffee consumption or coffee consumption is causing less sleep. It's just that there's some third variable. The reality is that we don't know. Just by looking at this graph, we do not know. Now, of course, common sense might tell you that it's actually kind of a catch-22. If you sleep less, you drink more coffee, and then because you're drinking more coffee, you might also sleep less, right? So like the causation might go both ways, but the point I'm trying to make is that you cannot infer causation just from correlation, okay? So when you're talking about these kinds of theories, very often the economist will be interested in establishing causation, okay? But in practice, a lot of the time, the only thing that we could really establish is correlation, because establishing causation is a lot more difficult, all right? So that's going to do it for this video. Like or subscribe if you find it useful, and leave comments below for suggestions for further videos. I will see you in the next video.